Leaders, pastors, pioneers of movements are often outward and forward focused. Often this means, or sometimes this means, that the inward life can be left unexplored or sometimes even ignored. How can leaders tend to the depths within them? And how might spiritual direction and spiritual directors be a part of that work? That's what we're talking about today. How best can we support clergy, pastors, and leaders and their formation? This is the Attaching to God podcast with Jeff and Sid Holsclaw, where we are exploring a neuroscience-informed spiritual formation, and this is produced by Embodied Faith. Today we have our special guest, David Clayton. He is a qualified and experienced spiritual director, supervisor, and behavioral analysis with a unique blend of expertise in behavioral sciences and spiritual direction. David seeks to provide a holistic approach that both emphasizes the inner and the depths of development, as well as practical applications. David was recently a speaker at a church planting and theology conference in England. And we were talking about that. And so I wanted to kind of continue that conversation about the deep needs of spiritual leaders and how spiritual direction might fit with that. And so I was like, let's be on the podcast. So David, welcome to the Attaching to God podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Great to be here with yourself and Sid today and share this conversation. It's very exciting, and I think it is an important area that needs looking at a little more closely. So thanks for this opportunity to
for sure.
develop that. Yeah.
Can I ask a question before we get into anything else?
Sure.
I'm curious, as Jeff introduced you, said that you have a background in behavior analysis as well as spiritual direction.
Yeah.
I'm curious, which came first for you? And how did one lead to the other?
Oh, gosh. Side tangent. Rabbit hole. Careful.
Oh, no,
Just
this
a short
is like,
one.
Yeah.
But I
okay,
just
actually
The
write
short
down.
version would be due to my life experience, I developed the capacity to be sensitive to behavior, and became very, very good at that, to say the least. So be able to read people and situations in a sense very accurately.
We call that street smarts in the U.S. Do you have like a little British kind of way of saying that?
The trade name is well, I'm not saying I am a natural, but there are the definitions of naturals that are really accurate. Naturally, it is an in-depth thing. It would be, going into the science of developmental trauma and how that can be processed. So I took my difficult experience and trained in different ways, and then became a friend of mine pointed me towards behavioural analysis. So I trained in behavioural analysis to be able to forensically codify exactly what I was noticing. And then more recently, I've codified my facial recognition and micro-expression training with Dr. David Matsumoto, who is a great guy and great training, may I say. So I'm able to have the natural inclination towards noticing, which is obviously a key thing in spiritual direction.
Right.
But now I'm able to actually codify that at quite a high level after further training.
That is just fascinating. And for our listeners, we talk a lot about attachment and how survival strategies often become the greatest gifts that we have as well when they're sort of redeemed and honed, and when it becomes one of the options we have available to us rather than the only option we have available to us. And so I just love hearing how out of the difficult background you've had, this gift emerges of being able to really pay attention to people's behavior and then being able to use that in a way that is a gift to the world. So I just want to celebrate that I think it's so great the way that God works out of the painful places of our life to offer, good work to the world. So I'm really glad that your trauma has become something that can be offered in a redemptive way to the world. And I know that there's a lot of work behind that. So thank you for doing that work.
Oh, bless you. Thank you.
Yeah.
We could do a whole podcast on that stuff, I can assure you.
We'll have
maybe we
to
should.
put a pin in that one.
Yeah.
So you talked a little bit about your behavioral analysis training, but I think before that you were trained in spiritual direction as well as other like kind of contemplative and ascetic traditions. Could you kind of fill out
Okay.
some of that background for you too?
Okay. So I'm of quite uh, an odd experience. I entered into when I was training in a evangelical charismatic Bible college. I was graced in that kind of energized spiritual place, with everything happening, to enter into apophatic contemplation, really. And I
Hmm.
was quite lucky to have a professor who was, I'd studied Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection and his work, The Practice and Presence of God, as part of my text. But then I ended up in the cloud of unknowing. I mean, most people were reading on, in Christ Jesus, and I was studying the cloud of unknowing with a professor and trying to understand what was going off in my life. So, I mean, this is donkeys years ago. So that kind of put me on a different trajectory to most. And then there's been this ongoing plod of prayer. So prayer would be my central thing. If you say, if anything, what is your life about? Well, it's prayer and knowing God. So in a way, to use the classic review of moving towards knowing God in the beatific vision, towards full union with God, to use the sort of more Catholic language. But so I, through circumstance, ended up being introduced to spiritual direction. I ended up working with some great people and living in a retreat house, and then going off to train with an internship with the Jesuits in England. So I did my I made the exercises and then completed, not complete fully, but did an amount of internship with the Jesuit Spirituality Center, and then went on from there and continued to study. I had a monastery not so far away, and I read and developed. So I've studied quite a lot of historical spirituality. So, Francis de Sales, Palain, Tanqueray, all of the kind of greats in the Catholic tradition. Got into studying the Orthodox pattern and studied the Philokalia, and travelled around that, and ended up training in Greece briefly in hesychasm practice, and then went on more recently, coming up to speed because it's a huge, again, and people say I need to write a book, but anyway.
I'm always telling people to write books because I'm always like, that sounds interesting. That could be a book.
Yeah, I'm blessed. So more recently, spending 3 years training with the Descalces Carmelite order, doing spiritual direction, spiritual transformation, training in Oxford. So that's associated with the Teresium Pontifical University in Rome. So I've come away with a diploma and an extra embedded year that I embedded the spiritual practice, because St. John of the Cross is one of my passions, So formally trained in a few bits and bobs, but informally,
Just a few.
informally work, study prayer for quite a few decades, puts you in place.
So how did you come to this place of really wanting or noticing the need for spiritual leaders to have a deep sense of, tell me how that emerged.
Well, spiritual leaders to have a deep sense. Yeah, spiritual leaders to have depth. I think is one way we could look at it, because there is an outward achievement, statistical criteria that people seem to lean more into, and go, a person is successful if there are a lot of people in whatever they're involved in. If the numbers are big, then therefore it's successful. Whereas the criteria, if you look at things like Thomas à Kempis' Imitations of Christ, success is a very different picture there. It's deep humility, deep sanctification, deep devotion, deep love, really. So I I'm an alongside person. I've always been an alongside person. This is, in discerning my election as a spiritual director, it's always been made clear that I've always been alongside people and raised up leaders and been a bit of a kingmaker, creating a few CEOs and experts in different fields. But it's noticing, is being alongside those people and going, there's something missing there. And not going, not judgmental or critical, but actually discerning and going, and I found, I suppose the opportunity's been there for leaders to come to me and to have conversation, and then it's realized, it's them that's realizing. It's not me going, oh, you need that. And that's not, it's not a blanket thing from board. This is more of an organic realization within the individuals and within their circumstance that there is something more, there is something better, there can be a deeper process. And it can be very difficult because you get the mimetic behaviors of our tribe knows what we're doing, we have it right, and particularly in certain, I'm being careful what I say here, but in certain areas of ecclesiology,
we're in America, we don't know anything about tribalized denomination, infighting. We have been delivered from that, and so thankfully, the new world has become more sanctified rather than the old world there in England. But carry on, brother. Yeah, I was just kidding, of course. Well, so I want to keep talking about kind of the inner life of the leaders and kind of the challenges. But alongside that, so you were talking about this great expertise of your kind of personal formation and spiritual direction, but also the kind of monastic or the ascetic kind of traditions that are feeding into that. That is a real rich experience, which I love, that you bring to this conversation, because I think, and I don't know if this is true in England, but in America, there's a huge explosion, and maybe I'm just finally getting caught up to it, but there's a huge explosion too of spiritual direction, training, of people receiving direction, at least in the evangelical world that I've been mostly a part of. So the low church kind of, moving into these kind of like more contemplative practices or kind of liturgical kind of ways of being. But I think a lot of times we don't bring that kind of depth of experience and training that maybe you bring. And so I think, so the question I think maybe that we could like kind of talk about is maybe what is spiritual direction, and then how can, what is the hope for the formation of leaders? And maybe we could talk about not just church leaders and movement pioneers, but also, corporate leaders. And then we'll kind of get onto that, like, how might we be getting off track with this explosion of talking about spiritual direction also? Maybe there's some things to be aware of. But what can we go to that? Like, what is spiritual direction? And kind of just start there as you understand it, right?
Yeah,
I know you're not speaking for the whole of history, but as you understand it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a vast thing, and I think you've nailed a really important point, that there is this voluminous explosion of things being called spiritual direction, which is okay. That's great, as long as they are bearing transformative kingdom dynamic. When it becomes deformative, as the Carmelites would say, then there's the question mark. So for me, and again, in this context, otherwise I would go on to the classic definition of it's this, this, and this, and it does this and that. It's that conversation. It's that, the three chairs in the room where the person is engaging with, and I'm going to say, because of potential, deist, non-deist conversation going on, with the higher power, with that which is more. So, and finding out who they are in relation to that, and who the absolute is in relation to them. So I'll use the term absolute and God as a kind of construct, so that we're not getting into particularly religious. I'm trying to keep it as broad as possible. So it's really about the person's movement towards understanding their absolute reality in response to an absolute. Psychotherapy would say it takes an absolute to observe an absolute person. And I think that's David Joplin who writes on that. But so if you were to use God language, it is the conversation between the person and God, and then finding out who they are in relation to God and who God is in relation to them. And it's relational. It's conversational. It's not self-improvement, but it's not just talking. Often I've heard the definition of people going, so counseling starts here, psychotherapy is here, and then spiritual direction is down here, because it gets into the deepest of the deep and doesn't look at the problems. It's not a problem-solving reality. It's a comprehension. So in the midst of that, one might realize, oh my goodness me, I've got this, and this wrong with me by psychotherapeutic definitions, according to certain medical manuals. And yet they're known that they are a loved child of God, and that there is something innately perfect in who they actually are. And that's okay. How they outwork that into interpersonal realities in society is something potentially slightly different, and how they cope, to use the psychological term of coping, is another conversation, and that would be, referred across. And I mean, even yesterday, somebody came to me and we're having a deep conversation. And I go, and you need to take that to either some good counselling or psychotherapy to walk that through, because it's snagging you. You're struggling with that. You're aware of it. You've named it. You need to be able to take that somewhere to process it. So is that okay to work on that basis? So it's that interaction between the absolute and the individual in some form of conversational relationship.
Well, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, and I know Sid's going to ask a really good question, but I was looking at your talk, and you use the word conversion.
Yeah.
I'm a good evangelical, so I love that language. But I thought you used that word kind of as part of your kind of understanding of spiritual direction, as the who God is to me and who I am to God. But that's not a static kind of thing. It's a process where I'm continually growing in that. And so that is a sense of conversion, transformation, of union with God. Is that right? Or is that, or do you not like using that language?
No, that's fine. Conversion morum, old Benedictine thing. I love diving into that. I think if we would take the theological premise that it is impossible to end our understanding in God, it is a continual movement towards and a continual process of growing and understanding and comprehension, because you're talking absolute. We're in time, we're in entropy, even worse. Time and space dissimulate, whereas this absolute is something which is beyond. So we can't necessarily comprehend it fully, but we can move towards it and become more like it. And that would be the process of conversion, to becoming more like that which we move towards. And in this case, choose the Judeo-Christian thing, we're moving towards becoming like Jesus, according to Scripture, if you're in that framework. So that would be the thing, that it is, and I like the way you look at it. It's an ongoing process. It doesn't end. Some people go, "Oh, I've got there. I'm super spiritual." And I go, well done. I'm still on my way, day by day, turning up, plodding along. It's and I think that helps us in our humility and our rationale that actually there are things way beyond our comprehension. And engaging, when we start to think about if God is, we use the Judeo-Christian thing. So if God is beyond the universe, as he created the universe, and we can't even comprehend the size of the universe, it just keep, scientists keep going, oh, I can't get that, or I can't get that, and we are, let's be clear, we're on a tiny little planet. We're a dot, which lasts probably, I don't know, 70, 80, 90, 100 years maybe, on a planet which is in turn going to be burned up by its sun in the solar system at some point in the future, which is part of galaxy which is spinning away, which is part of billions of other galaxies in this huge creation, and God is easily one step beyond all that.
Mm-hmm.
We automatically come to, well, there's more to this. There's more to life. There is something more. So therefore, character, integrity, love, all these depths start to be drawn to the fore more in the process. And I think spiritual direction in using that kind of term helps. So it's quite necessary in this current age, I think, really necessary.
Yeah.
For sure.
I like to talk about spiritual direction as I like the way you're talking about it. All right. And I like to talk about it in the sense of it's the process of being able to discern the invitations of, in your language, the absolute, or I would say, right, the invitations of God, and then being able to discern how I will respond to that. Right. And so it's this sense of the invitations are always there. The invitations to notice you're part of something bigger, the invitations to receive the love in the midst of the mess, the invitations to be known and to be loved. And then the response of continuing to lean and orient your whole life towards this pathway of becoming more like Jesus, becoming unified with God. And so if spiritual direction is not doing that, then I don't know what it is, right? And so that's the spiritual. So sometimes when I hear conversations about what people are calling spiritual direction, and this is, again, no judgment or insult, at least people are having conversations,
Yep.
and I'm glad about that. But sometimes when the conversation is about, more about myself and what I'm wanting to do and sort of what I'm noticing, but it doesn't ever come back to who is God, what is God inviting me into, and how am I discerning a response to that, then I don't know what we're doing together. So and I hear you sort of with that same trajectory of there is a goal. And the goal is to become unified with the only one who is truly real. And so that pathway, and that's the journey. Yeah,
Can I just drop in the word ontological?
absolutely.
That, I mean, the only one that is real, truly real, that's just beautiful. That is just beautiful. I'm nicking that. For me.
It's yours.
But this all points to an ontological reality, a deepening of becoming, Ignatius would say the margis, the more, at each point, at each step, at each thing in it. And if we are moving in that, then it is ad majorem glorum, for the glory of God. The motivation isn't, like you say, the motivation isn't about, I want, I could tell so many jokes about what people have said in spirit. What's your desire? Well, I want it. Yeah, okay. And it all moves down to the actual deeper desire of really knowing God, union with God, But I think just to frame it in ontological forms, in becoming, because I think that's core to spiritual direction. The conversation. We could say, and take out spiritual direction, and accompany and becoming, and use completely different language, emphasizing the ontological in that, So, but I resonate exactly with what you're saying.
Yeah. And that's why Jeff and I, spend so much time and energy talking about our attachment with God, because if we're living out of a protective, defensive, insecure posture, it's very difficult to find and discern those invitations from the one who loves, from the one who is stable, from the one who is secure. And so that's why so much of our life is oriented around how do we repair the ruptures in our attachment with God so that we can be on this journey and towards becoming. Yeah.
So this is so great. I love this whole conversation. So I want to kind of mine some of the depth that David brings. So I want to bring up this sayings of the Desert Father, and I want to talk maybe a little bit Ignatius, and then Saint John of the Cross is kind of is continuing this conversation, and kind of shifting then to then leaders and movement leaders and pioneers. I think you dropped this into your talk. I think at the beginning. So I'd love to hear why and then kind of what it stirred up. But you said that there's a saying ascribed to Isaac the Syrian, quote, "It is better to acquire purity of heart than to convert a whole nation of heathens," end quote. So it's better to have purity of heart than to go out and do amazing deeds. Why did you kind of throw that out at the beginning of your talk? And what were you kind of hoping to stir up? I know it gets at this depth and the ontology and all this stuff, but
Okay. What a great challenge. So, context is everything. That I was speaking to a lot of activists who recognize the importance of evangelism in their context of offering the reality of salvation through Jesus Christ in their ministry. So they don't necessarily recognize the importance of knowing God at depth in their ministry to enable them to offer something which is at depth to others. So there was a cultural reality to that, and using Evelyn, I think I ended on Evelyn Underhill talking about the church doesn't need new ideas, new gadgets, whatnots, but needs true evangelists. It needs converted individuals, and Wesley points to that, and I use that in that talk as well. Give me, 100 men who care not a straw about sin, and that will convert England. It's that depth of reality, that depth of soul. And I saw some of that in some of the revival movements that I experienced back in the day, in some characters' lives who were really impacted in that. So it's not a full no, this area, the high church thinks this, the middle church thinks this. There is something consistently across the way. So I was speaking into what state is your heart, and doing the prophetic thing and calling to repentance, really, from wherever anyone was at, that they could go deeper with God and to call them deep to God, because that's important. They will stand, in their theology, and the Christian kind of premise, they will stand at one point before God in judgment and be accountable for their lives. I shared recently, to bring in the leadership thing, talking to spiritual directors and clergy from Anglican, Methodist, and other different sort of denominations. The point of, I can't remember where it is. I'm trying to rack where it is. So we'll just skip the Bible references. That's okay. But the Bible talks about do not be teachers. Don't hastily become teachers, because you'll be more accountable. You'll be doubly accountable before God.
Right.
So I said to them, well, if you think about that, so if you're going to be spiritually directing clergy and you have to be further down the road than the clergy spiritually, we'll use that term spiritually, like ascetic theology and mystical theology, depends how you want to define it. You're going to be even more accountable than the clergy. So don't pick up this mantle and going, so in really what I think I mean, it's some time ago since I did that. It's nearly a year ago. Gosh, time flies.
Yeah.
Hopefully I'll be on next year's, who knows? So the point is to look at the hearts. Where are these people in their hearts? Are they is it just activity? Because I think again in Scripture, Jesus points to, oh, you did this, you raised the dead, you spoke in tongues, you said
Right.
prophecies, you did that, you said,
But I didn't know you.
yeah,
You didn't know me. Yeah.
yeah. So
Yeah,
I
for
think it
sure.
was that kind of premise. The point, because a lot of my work in all of the different sectors is going from presented to actual.
Hmm.
And going, well, this is what's presented, and this could be statistically correct and economically correct and da 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 da. However, there's an actual depth, there's a reality, there's a truth somewhere embedded in that, which, and to use a phrase my a friend coined for me, I tend to get to the heart of the matter of the heart. I tend to put my finger on
Mhm.
the pulse and to look at that. So what I was trying to do was draw that to the fore, so that we're not looking at the outward presented, we're successful, we've got lots of people in our church, we've got this growing, we have a beautiful pyramid scheme going, and our organization is, great sales technique, great elicitation
Right.
and all that, and marketing manipulation. Rather than we've got the lost, the broken, we're putting them back together. We've got people who are knowing God personally. So it was that kind of emphasis. Is that okay? I wandered a bit on that, but I hope that's
Well, that's
okay.
good. Well, I want to throw this to Sid. So, in our American context, we often talk about like character and competencies. Is that, we want to focus on character more than competencies, but oftentimes churches and movements, they just see someone who has high competencies and they elevate them. They get results, they get things done. Um, and then, if something bad happens, then we say, oh, their character didn't match their competencies, right?
Yeah,
And so
after the
so I'll
fact.
throw this to Sid. Do you feel like this conversation's getting at that, or do you feel like there's something that's even deeper that we've been talking about in this?
Okay, ask me that question again in a different way.
It so are we talking about character? This like when it comes to the purity of the heart or the matters of the heart, are we actually talking about something that's even deeper there? Just because you've worked with a lot of leaders also. And so I'm just throwing out ways we typically talk and wondering, is that
Well, I
helpful
guess
or are
it
we
depends on what we mean by character, right? So I
okay,
think you and I sometimes talk about how character is the default. Like it's who you are when you're living from your defaults, the things that
sure.
are automatic. And
Mhm.
so if that's what we're talking about when we say character, then yeah, I mean, there's so much pressure on leaders to perform and to show, to demonstrate competency. That's the stuff that's measurable. And I think there's a lot of shame or hiddenness around the default patterns that leaders know they have and they recognize and they see, but they don't feel the freedom or the spaces to be able to talk about those or unpack those, or when those become clear, immediately their leadership is questioned. So I would say those character, that default pattern is coming out of the ways our nervous systems are shaped. And that comes out of attachment, that comes out of first formation, that comes out of all kinds of stuff. So it's a formation issue. And that requires lots of repair and repatterning. And so I guess it depends on what we mean when we say character.
Sure. Yeah.
So if that's what we mean, I think we're going deep enough. If
What do you think, David?
I think, and this is drawing on a current conversation, so I'm just writing on this, so I'm not going to share too much, but there is, let me do it story wise. So I'll use a name. So in a lecture a couple of years ago, Sarah Coakley came out with a really interesting comment saying, if church leaders and church lay were more virtuous, we wouldn't need so much safeguarding. A
hmm,
paraphrase.
hmm.
And that's stayed with me, and I've done quite a bit of work around that. And then looking more recently, particularly in some of the other points I'm developing, there is a response to, and particularly I'll use safeguarding because it's a hot topic in the UK at the moment. There's a response to bringing legislation and law rather than moral responsibility. So therefore character.
Yeah.
The second, to develop character, like they said, requires formation, and therefore is a much harder way than just putting a group of rules in the way. And if we follow these rules, then everything will be hunky-dory, because it just doesn't work. Because that only works with a certain amount of humans. Behaviorally, just rules don't work. Law doesn't necessarily work. It's a social constraint, and that's fine, but that's external constraint, not internal change. And I think the premise that we're talking about now is internal change, is actual character, actual integrity, actual living toward virtuous, which is the whole point of spiritual direction. If we can use that term, it's the process of helping people funnel their formation towards that which is good, that which is better, and to not try and heal them, but to walk with them on their healing journey. Transformation. Let's not use healing, because that sounds like, oh, they've been broken. We're all broken. I mean, I think I even quoted Chase using his 4 points in the talk about humans being broken, hiding behind masks, not wanting to be seen behind their masks, and then formative, like you said, 0 to 2, 0 to 7 or 0 to 14, depending on critical thinking. So, yeah, I think that nails it. Really, it's either the human being does the work or doesn't do the work. And if they don't do the work, then, law is our legislative process is the external constraint to keep them into an ordered behavior. But if they were actually good and actually knew God, which is that all the absolute, deism, non-deism, that's the difference. Actual change, actual character. And that doesn't mean they're a perfect individual. I mean, I'm just writing a talk for Morelands College in the UK. Hopefully I'm doing a talk with them next year, and it's based on developing imperfection and looking at how Maslow's viewpoint of psychology is about divergence away from a point of perfection. And I'm going, well, is that a really healthy way? I agree with Maslow on that in some ways when we view people, because we're not viewing character, we're viewing certain coping behaviors. Anyway, so yes.
Yes. Well, it sounds like we could have many more episodes to talk about. We're kind of getting to our time right now. We didn't even get to
and we didn't talk about John of the Cross
and John of the Cross. I feel like we probably should just put something on the calendar where we could talk about Saint Ignatius and Ignatian spirituality, because he was a pioneer of a movement that has now lasted over 500 years, and it has and he kind of updated or brought spiritual direction to the laity. He's kind of the figure that has brought all of us evangelicals into the fold for even thinking about spiritual direction. So it maybe would be great to have a whole case study on kind of the birth and the process of even that movement, just to kind of help us think through it. Maybe we could find some other Ignatian experts and kind of do that. That sounds pretty fun. Sid or David, do you have any kind of last thoughts to bring it kind of together, or otherwise we could just keep talking for another hour, but that probably is not what we should do.
I would.
Go on, Sid.
Oh, go ahead.
No, go on.
Go ahead, Sid.
No, I was just going to say, I think underneath this whole conversation is, I want to return back to something you said at the beginning, David, which I think is a highlight of the Ignatian exercises too, is that perfection is not the goal. What is the goal is union with God, and that union means sort of a radical acceptance of all that is not right within us, as we are loved by the God who loves us in spite of all of that. And then that love is what transforms, right? And so I think, I'm always wanting to come back to, I think one thing that the evangelical church, and I don't know, like shame is something we're really good at, right? And I think that's why there are so many leaders that are so afraid to talk about those things that are unhealed, because of the shame that comes along with it, because of that expectation of you're a leader, you should be better. But I think I just want to sort of say again that, this whole life is a preparation for the union that will become a reality in the next life. And so that sense of we're on our way to the next life in the way that we're being shaped and formed for union with God. And that union includes a now element of we can be unified with God now, even in the things that are still unhealed and broken. And so that sense of being able to allow God to meet us where we are without that expectation of I can only be met by God when. So that's just something I would want to say. And as a making sure that that's an emphasis in this whole conversation, that perfection is not the goal.
Mm-hmm. You have any last thoughts, David?
Wow, thumbs up to that. Definitely. That's
welcome to my world.
Yeah,
I'm always just
no.
like, well, we'll just let
goodness
Sid
gracious me.
summarize
what a
it.
blessing.
It's
That's
so great.
Beautiful. I think I just add the comment that the recognition and the migration of souls across the different denominations is a social reality. When there's an economic downturn, there's a movement in towards the apophatic and the kind of Carmelite kind of prayer. And that's been happening. There's been a lot of people going over to the Orthodox from the evangelical side of things. There's been a lot more evangelical seeking depth and hungering for depth because there isn't security. So in a way, all these difficulties point us towards exactly what you've talked about. That knowledge of God, that knowledge of being loved, being safe. Even if it isn't safe. I mean, the apophatic tradition is in the mystical tradition, which we could probably do a whole set on. There's very much a leaning into that now and an interest in mysticism, which is all based, it's called the science of love, and it's not called the science of love for any reason. It is the science of love. It is the reality of what is the meaning of being a human being. Well, it's to move towards, this and that. And you could take different religious frameworks, and I'm being cautious today and just not because we're not specifically and using generic language, but, I think that what you said was really the emphasis of what it's about. And leaders, not just leaders, everybody needs to lean into that actual becoming through engaging with God, absolute, and recognizing that acceptance, that love, that connection.
Yeah.
So everybody needs to learn to pray. So they need spiritual directors of some form.
There you go. And the goal is, as the title of this podcast is attaching to God, there's lots of different ways, union with God, the fear of God, like there's all sorts of different ways of speaking about that, but letting that, the purity of heart, as you mentioned in the quote from Isaac the Syrian, so that all of our activities overflow from that love of God and love of others rather than, just having to-do lists and, growth charts and, statistics and, metrics, for how the church is doing, but rather can we get to the depth of our hearts and the conversion that is the continual conversion that's necessary for all of us. Well, thank you for taking some time to be with us. Where can people connect with you or follow kind of some of the things you're up to? And
okay, so different hats, different world. My email address is the best connection, which is theclayton1@hotmail.com. That's a generic one, but from a behavioural analyst point of view, I have a website relating to that, which is the Monos Collective, which is a developing project utilizing monastic principles, shall we say, in impacting economics, education, and everything else, every other field that we can network across, as the monastics used to do. I also have a website which is, I forgot, it's something like David Clayton, monastic spirituality.wordpress.
Jeff will put it in the show notes.
Yeah,
He'll figure it out.
So
I'll find it.
But yeah, Does email is the easiest, and I suppose if you look at the Monos Collective, be interested in people's thoughts on that as a developing project as we move towards what would be best, what would be ad maiorem de gloriam, as Ignatius would say.
For the greater glory of God. Amen. Well, again, this is the Attaching to God podcast produced by Embodied Faith. Please like and subscribe and share this to whoever you think might benefit from listening. And David, thank you so much for being on.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Thank you. It's been a really great conversation. Really enjoyed it. God bless you both.
You too. I look forward to the next one.
Indeed.
Yeah, let's get it on the calendar.